The following podcast is brought to you by fantasy-animation.org, an online educational resource dedicated to fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Alongside this podcast, Fantasy Animation provides an online space for discussion and debate amongst like-minded academics, practitioners, special interest groups, and fans to meet, discuss, and share their respective insights with wider audiences. Through a range of editorials, reviews, and creative reflections, we cover everything from experimental animation to the Playmobil movie, which is experimental in its own way, I guess. To find out more, visit fantasy-animation.org. But for now, do enjoy the show. Hello listeners, welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. Today I think I am Alex Sargent.
And today I am definitely Chris Holliday.
Or are you a manifestation of the underworld, Chris?
That we'll find out over the next hour. I'm certainly something that is labyrinthine and potentially allegorical, but we'll see.
Okay, so listeners, today we're doing Pan's Labyrinth. Again, luckily for you, it's not just Chris and I joining us this week. We have a very esteemed guest and delighted to introduce us to the podcast, Professor Deborah Shaw, author of such works as The Three Amigos, the Transnational Filmmaking of Guillermo del Toro, Alejandro González Iñárritu and Alfonso Cuarón, published by Manchester University Press, and the Transnational Fantasies of Guillermo del Toro, co-edited with Anne Davies and Dolores Tierney. Deborah is also a professor at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, therefore, onto the show. Deborah, thanks for joining us.
Hi, people. Thanks for inviting me.
Deborah, we thought you would be an obvious guest for Pan's Labyrinth. We've been wanting to do it on the show for a long time. I certainly have. It's a film I'm itching to chat about, but I wondered if we could start off by you just telling the listeners where you're coming at the movie from, maybe the story of your personal relationship with it and some of the sort of broad headlines that you sort of think about in relationship to the movie.
Well, I mean, in a way, I went on the journey with the film because I'm a Latin American film specialist and came to the areas that are outside my specialism because there were these Mexican filmmakers who were making English language film. So really, I started as a beginner, and I loved the journey that the film took me on because it took me on, researching fantasy, all these different kind of connections with art cinema, fantasy cinema. I knew about the Spanish politics, but I hadn't seen the Spanish politics of the post-Civil War treated in this way. So I kind of wanted to explore how effective that was and why this film had broken through in a way that a lot of the other films that I was researching, writing about, teaching hadn't. Most of my students hadn't heard of most of the films that I was writing on, but they had this film. So I was kind of interested in exploring why was it that this film had broken through.
Yeah, that certainly chimes with my experience when I first saw it. I think I was probably an undergrad or master's student, and I hadn't heard of Guillermo del Toro before, and I was sort of starting to formulate my own sort of feelings on cinema and what I might do as a research project, potentially for a PhD. And I think this was a crystallizing moment for me in terms of developing an intellectual relationship with fantasy, if I'm honest, because exactly as you say, it's a movie that treats fantasy. Well, it does two things. One, it treats fantasy in a very different way from, say, the mainstream genre, but it also mainstreamed a way of approaching fantasy that is sort of, I've since learned, part of all these different traditions around the world, and that made the topic really exciting for me.
Yeah, and it made us take it seriously, didn't it?
Yeah.
It was like this is a very serious issue, and fantasy actually is the best medium to tell this story. To reach these people, more people. So yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a fascinating movie to play with and unpack and offer different interpretations as to what's sort of bubbling around in it. So I guess we should get to it. Chris, you watched it, had a slightly different relationship with the movie.
Yes, I mean, if we'd have done this podcast yesterday, I would have next to no relationship with this movie. But I've come to it fresh, and I've just seen it, and I was saying to you a little bit before we started that I thought it was superb. I don't know much about the kind of Francoist period that it's sort of relating to. It's sort of historical context, the sort of historical paradigms that are clearly both circulating around and embedded fully within the film. I liked its relationship, and it's interesting you use the word kind of crystallized, because for me it crystallized a lot of things and took things that we've talked about previously on this podcast across a number of episodes in different directions. So it kind of crystallized a particular kind of relationship between allegory and fantasy, which I really liked, and also this idea of CGI. And obviously the film has lots and lots of visual effects. Again, like previous episodes we've done, it sort of mixes physical, practical effects with and in-camera effects and animatronics with digital technology. And so it was, again, crystallizing some things around CGI's relationship to the monstrous. And there's been a bit of writing around CGI's relationship to monstrosity, and how CGI often in film, it's interesting, again, that you say it's different in ways to sort of other mainstream films, that the CGI is not necessarily the domain of evil in the film. So I have some interesting, or hopefully some things to say about digital technology, its relationship to the monstrous, and sort of trying to locate it, because that's one of the things that a lot of people have said to me about the film. Or you should see it because it's got incredible digital effects and visual effects, and those people were not wrong. So yeah, I'm really excited to kind of work through, as you say, all the different angles and work out what the film's about. Maybe that's normally Alex's first question is, what's the film about? So I'm hoping to be able to get into that.
I mean, just getting back to the digital effects. I mean, I wrote about this film a long time ago, and I'd need to look back at my notes. But one of the things that Del Toro is really keen on is having as many practical effects as possible, and being very creative in the design of the actual creatures, and only using CGI when it's absolutely necessary. So
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting in response to what you're saying as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I thought it was, in terms of the way and the precision of the effects, and when there's a practical effect, and it sort of doesn't matter that you are, special effects spectatorship is a very sort of thorny and complex issue in terms of moments when we assent to the technology and assent to the effect, when we buy into it. Is a special effect only defined in relationship to what it's not? We want to know it's an effect. We don't want it to be sort of invisible. And so it's and because again, and again, like so many films, it uses a sort of a fantasy film that uses a child spectator, essentially, a surrogate spectator. I thought it was an interesting. It's not about effect, Alex. It's not about animation, but it's about belief, and I also like the fact that this was a fictional world that had its own mythology, and you had characters in it that believed and didn't believe, and so I liked that sort of idea of spectatorship as it's embedded in the film itself.
And from what I've remember, actually, just from watching sort of DVD extras on the disc, there's a lot of CGI in subtraction and removal in this movie. A lot of the prominent uses of CGI are taking out Doug Jones's legs as a fawn, or the sort of horrific moment with Captain Vidal's face injury. So there's got a lot of moments where CGI is at its most prominent when it takes something away rather than adds something to it, which I think is a really interesting dialogue with the fantasy narrative, which essentially adds a fantasy narrative to pertaining to be historical reality. So there's a sort of give and take, push and pull relationship between the use of CGI and the use of fantasy in the movie that's quite interesting to think about too.
Yeah.
I guess on that note, my first note on the film is exactly that it opens in Spain in 1944, and I was not expecting. We've talked previously, I think, about fantasy's relationship to allegory, and how fantasy, and I think you've challenged this, on occasion, that one of the criticisms of fantasy is that it only means something when it's allegorizing something, that it only means something if you can read fantasy symptomatically as a product of the culture that both produces it and creates it. But what I liked about this film is that immediate sort of title card of Spain 1944, I thought, okay, so this is not, and the way that the fantasy works in the film, and I thought, I wonder is this something where I'm not having to read the allegory per se into the monsters? Though I like the fact that the fantasy and the monsters coexist with a political climate that's being placed front and center. So this isn't a film made a couple of years ago that is set today, that is allegorizing the 1940s. It's set in the 40s and has that sort of framing historical narrative onto which it then affixes, or into which it then places all these different sort of fantasy elements. So I was trying to think about fantasy's relationship to allegory, and then more broadly what the stakes of that sort of 1944 setting, really. So I think that's what I mean by sort of sharpening the relationship between allegory and fantasy. Fantasy is not necessarily allegorizing per se the politics, but it seems to coexist in the fictional world with it.
I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, the relationship between the fantasy and the reality. And really the question was, does the fantasy give light to the reality, or does it distort it? And when I originally wrote about this, I struggled with the ending, because I thought that people that didn't know about the Spanish Civil War may have thought that because of the fantasy element, there was a happy ending. That the fascists are defeated, Captain Vidal is defeated, the Maquis have their victory, Ophelia goes to the underworld and lives happily ever after. But then I had to do a talk on the 10 years of the film. And it really made me think about how the film has outlasted the moment, and how it's become this kind of perennial allegory for fascism. And so while, yes, it does distort what happened historically, it's become a commentary on the forces of evil, of fascism, that are both embedded in the post-Spanish Civil War, but, we can also apply it to Trump's America, or, the rise of the right now. And, Del Toro has tweeted an image of the pale man when Trump was elected, saying, he's still here. So I thought that was kind of interesting, of the kind of marriage between fantasy to bring out the reality. The fascist is always there, the pale man is always there, and he can be reanimated at any point in history.
I'm so glad you mentioned the ending, Deborah, because I'm obsessed with that, because that sort of dynamic. And when I've been thinking about the movie in terms of, I remember walking out of the cinema and then, and dragging about, various groups of friends to go see it for a month period. And I'd invariably have the same frustrating conversation with them, as they would walk out of the cinema and all they'd want to talk about is the faun real or not, which I guess we can talk about on the podcast for a bit. And the film suddenly, sets that up. Although I think Del Toro sort of stepped away from that question as if he never really wanted that to be a thing. But there are certain moments that I think certainly invite the spectator to deliberate on that. Is what's happening here a little girl's imagination shielding her or from the true horror of war, or is what's happening here a sort of quote unquote real fantasy narrative interweaving with a historical narrative?
Yeah, and it's both.
Well, yes, it's both, and it's neither, in the sense that sort of in the sense that actually, as exactly you're saying, there's to think about this as one's a historical reality and one is a fantasy is to completely misunderstand the melding of tones going on here, because actually the film ends on a fantasy. It ends on the communists defeating the fascists, which and so that's more fantastical than the girl dying and going to the underworld, or at least just as fantastical. And so I think what's really fascinating about them isn't the question, is the faun real or not? It's the question, do we have to decide? And if we don't decide, what fun can we have? Because actually the tone of the movie is much more about the interweaving of fantasy and reality across the two worlds, rather than there are two worlds in sort of contrast or dialogue with one another.
I think that's exactly the approach I would take. I didn't like the whole debate. Didn't she? Is she? Isn't she? It's a fantasy structure. So yes, she does go to the underworld. And I think the main point is the monsters are real, and the heroes are real, and they may take human form. The Captain Vidal and the Pale Man are mirrors of each other, and they both exist. In our fears, the captain is the wolf, and he is the pale man, and he's also an actual man who can inflict terrible harm on people. So yes, absolutely, all of these things, which is why the fantasy and the realism is such a good, format for this film.
Yeah, and then if you sort of play with that a little bit, the sort of that trickles into, it's almost like to me, it's almost as if Chris and I make this metaphor on the podcast all the time, but it's almost like Guillermo del Toro takes oil and takes water, takes fantasy and reality at the beginning, and then puts them together in a beaker, and then just stirs them. And stirs them and stirs them and stirs them to the point that at the end of the movie, it's hard to tell which is which anymore.
Yeah, and that's he talks about that fusion and how he has the fantasy, color palettes, for example, move into the realist color palette. So it's a very deliberate merging of the two forms.
Well, actually, on that note of merging, I was looking a little bit at the film's relationship to visual effects and CGI. It seems that the way that it's sort of being talked about is how, again, it offers something different. It's more of a kind of careful, considered, and sort of suggestive melding between live action and effects, but essentially historical reality, a fictional world rooted in history, and then a more sort of hypothetical fantasy world rooted in CGI and a world of what if and so forth. But placing the film within a sort of CGI context, a lot of the writing around the film. Well, there's the piece that I'm reading at the moment that places the film in relationship to something like the Mummy, which is about a collision or an intrusion of the real, a historical reality with kind of fantasy. And one of the ways that the film The Mummy is talked about is that the visual effects, the digital effects of all these sort of reanimated corpses and so forth are sort of placed in inverted commas. Like, we know the visual effects are evil. These are the monsters, and they're in inverted commas, and they kind of come in, and CGI is very much anchored to this domain of the evil, and our world is the good world, because the way that the monsters are being treated is a kind of with this ironic reflexivity. But Alan Kirby, in a book on digimodernism, cites Pan's Labyrinth particularly as a film which kind of juxtaposes a similarly real period, i.e. the 1940s, with this CGI realm of the fairy tale and horror. But he says that it entirely omits this kind of, he says the horror. The film admits entirely the postmodern is presumably superfluous. Its intertwining of ontological levels is richer and more suggestive than many more commercial movies. And then he goes on to compare it to kind of Lord of the Rings, and then a little bit later on Harry Potter. But there's something quite dexterous and quite skillful in the way that the fantasy and the CGI is combined together with the historical reality of Spain in the 1940s. Of course, it raises these obvious questions about, okay, so who are the real monsters? What makes things and people grotesque? And actually, as a question I was going to ask, I guess, Alex, but both of you really, is when I was watching this, I was thinking, okay, so what kind of fantasy then is it? Is it, the film is established in the 1940s and we have this intrusive fantasy. And then I thought, well, actually, it's probably something like an Alice in Wonderland style portal quest where Ophelia goes through the sort of magic labyrinth into the world, into the underworld sort of thing. So off air, I said to Alex, I'm going to ask you, which one is it then? Which one is it? Is it a portal quest where a character goes through, or is it an intrusive fantasy where fantasy comes into the historical real? And Alex said it was neither.
It's a liminal, Chris. So these are back to we use these categories all the time from Farah Mendelssohn's book Rhetorics of Fantasy. A liminal fantasy actually it's back to this idea of is the fantasy real or not being part of the question and part of the sort of atmosphere of the movie. It's a liminal fantasy takes its roots from a genre called the fantastic, which I think we've talked about on the podcast before, but it's sort of articulated by Sven-Stan Todorov in his book The Fantastic. And it's basically stories that evoke their own stories that invoke their own disbelief, stories that that are about whether things are real or not, and whether we should be believing them or not. So, a classic story that fits into the genre of the fantastic would be something like Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, where a series of fantastical events are recounted to the reader from the perspective of the narrator, and by the end of the story, you can't work out whether these things are really happening in the story or whether they're sort of signs of the character's own mental derangement, as probably Poe would have put it, at least. So this has an element of that going on here. It collides things that we are nominally supposed to believe in with things that we are nominally not supposed to believe in. And that's the rhetoric of the movie. It's about that clash and about encouraging the sort of spectator to always be almost adopting a somewhat critical distance from the movie. So I guess that's what it fits into.
The point of view of this film is Ophelia's, and she starts by reading fairy tales. And then, there's a really interesting relationship with literature throughout the film. And funnily enough, the film has now been written into a novel, but I can talk a bit more about that later. But Ophelia's world is never in doubt. It's the doubting adults who are the problem in this film, and the audience is always placed in the position of Ophelia. So we never don't believe the fantasy. We might question the motives of the faun, but we never question whether he's real if we enter into the world that Del Toro opens for us.
It's interesting you pose that as a question, though. So do you think the film it offers you a way of not entering that world, or do you think...
No, I really don't. I think the only reading he gives us is, it's Pan's Labyrinth. You go into Pan's Labyrinth. It's not, I think this whole does Pan exist? Does the underworld exist? Within the world of the film and within understanding Del Toro's kind of, cosmology, really, fantasy is real. This is not a question. That's my reading of it.
Well, I suppose, I've heard Alex previously say, that fantasy exists, and that's certainly this idea of liminal fantasy seems to fit exactly with that. I mentioned at the start, that I liked the fact that this was a world, or a fictional world, that had its own mythology. It has its own history, but it has its own tales. And if it has its own tales, then it naturally has people that believe them, then it has people that doesn't believe them. That's one of the ways I think that the quote unquote realism of a fictional world in a film or whatever it is sort of established. There are facts that are known to some, to all, and to none. And so there's an interesting, the world has its own mythology, and then you have bigger questions of belief. But it's interesting that you said that the film is told from Ophelia's point of view, and I've got a couple of notes. That she's kind of escaping the real. She's using fantasy as a kind of coping mechanism, as a moment of catharsis. You have characters that surround her. I think her mum says magic does not exist. You have Vidal, who is one of the best villains and who I actively cheered at the end when he got his comeuppance. He calls fairy tales junk. And so obviously there are these different registers of belief. But in terms of subjectivity, you have that one of the final shots, which is one of the shots from Vidal's point of view, where he's looking at Ophelia talking to the faun, and the faun's not there. And that was the first moment that I thought that was a really interesting moment, because it visualizes belief.
Yeah, but a couple of things. One, Ophelia doesn't use fantasy to escape her reality.
Yeah.
Fantasy is very hard. She has to go and meet the pale man. She has to kind of do disgusting things with a toad. So fantasy isn't this shiny world. The reward at the end comes from facing fantasy and all of its horrors. And I just had a thought as well with the Captain Vidal at the end. He doesn't see the faun, and then he's shot in the eye, which is quite interesting. So it's almost like his point of view is destroyed because it's not valid.
Yeah.
Maybe I'd like to unpack the sort of political substance of any of this, because I've never really quite thought that bit all the way through. But it seems to be equating the ability to imagine with some sort of progressive politics in the movie, and that it seems to equate a fascist as someone who refuses to engage in a fantasy.
Yes.
And I'm just interested in what your thoughts would be on that, Deborah.
I think that's a lovely thought, a really interesting way of reading it. I was thinking about the doctor who is shot, and when he says he has some final line, which something to do with the fact that people like you talking to the captain can't see any other way. You can only see following orders. And I think you're right. Disobedience is a key theme of the film, the power of disobedience. And in order to be disobedient, you have to have the power of imagining another reality. So I think your point is a very good one. I think everything we're saying here is that fantasy isn't escape. Fantasy is a way of reaching a different, a better reality.
There's one way to look at it, which is yes, she uses it as a coping mechanism, but actually she doesn't use it as a coping mechanism simply because, as you say, like the fantasy world is difficult and kind of grubby. This isn't a sort of pleasurable escape from the cruel reality of Spain in 1944. I mean, it is that, because one of obviously the way that the film sets up its geography is the fact that you join characters in the middle of sort of directional movement. So they're traveling to the countryside, and actually one of the early conversations between Ophelia and her mum is about the noises that you hear, that you're used to having an experience, an audiovisual sensation of modernity versus this sort of natural space. So they're already detached and removed, and it's it sort of sets up that dislocation. And so I thought, okay, so I wonder whether then the fantasy is compensating for her dislocation, a sense of geographical dislocation, but also the cruelties of the real, because she very rarely shares the screen. She's often on her own. She very rarely shares the screen with other characters who aren't her mother. And then you're absolutely right that actually the fantasy isn't presented as this moment of escape necessarily. It's grubby, and it's task based, and when she when she takes and eats a couple of grapes, that reveals her inability to be obedient, going back to your point about themes of disobedience. So yeah, I think the fantasy does more than just offer an escape from the real and make it easy for us to make claims about fantasy as this moment of catharsis. I think actually it's a lot more complex than that, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and actually, and these are really good points, and actually the Maquis are also living in a fantasy world. The reality is, as I think Ophelia and Mercedes and the doctor say to them, you're not going to win this one. And they know that, and they kind of say, well, at least we're going to make it hard for them. So theirs also is a kind of impossible utopia that they're fighting for, which is its own kind of fantasy, I guess. So I think Alex's point about, the fascists have the closed down mentality versus the kind of, Maquis and Ophelia, who have this potential fantasy, which allows them to reach another level.
But this is the paradox of fantasy. I mean, the word escape, every time it comes up on the podcast and just in conversation at conferences or anything to me, the more it's used, the less I understand what it means. Because there's I can't think of a fantasy film that fits this criteria, because even obligatory Wizard of Oz of the week reference, but even like the Wizard of Oz, a classic film of supposed escapism, Dorothy may sing over the rainbow, but when she gets there, one, she immediately wants to go home. She doesn't want to be in Oz. And two, when she's in Oz, she's attacked by wicked witches and threatened with her life. Exactly. And there is no where's this film that we all think exists where the characters jump into clouds and sing a song and then come back? It doesn't exist. What exists is a way of telling stories in which characters process reality, for want of a better word, through a different lexicon, a different vocabulary. The whole point of the Wizard of Oz, right, is that she learns to see her home differently because of the journey she goes on. And we could get into a massive conversation about the politics of that movie, but we'll pause that one. We'll come back to Pan's Labyrinth.
Well, actually, let's not pause that one just for a second, because Del Toro has cited it as an influence, and in the final scene, she's wearing her red shoes when Ophelia becomes the Princess Moana. And I thought it was interesting that it subverts the kind of hero's journey type tales, in that Ophelia doesn't return home. I always wondered
Yes.
why, Dorothy goes back, wants to go to drab Kansas. And here Ophelia does stay in the kind of, so she transcends the drab reality. And unlike, there is the reference to the Wizard of Oz, but there's also a subversion to the Wizard of Oz because she doesn't go home. She goes somewhere better.
No, I think that's important because I think the Wizard of Oz is often. I mean, I go back and forth on the movie, but I think it's often read as an incredibly conservative, tale of valuing one's own home over anything else. What does Dorothy say at the end? I won't look beyond my own backyard because if it's not there, then I don't need it, or I won't go looking for it. It's that closing down, of horizons is what the film sort of celebrates.
Yeah.
I think that's perhaps a slightly simplistic reading of the movie, but it's certainly been written that way by a lot of scholars. So yeah, this is a sort of a left-wing progressive retelling of that, in that the character does transcend to the new horizon of possibility.
Some people didn't like the ending. I had a discussion with a Spanish scholar who felt that the ending was almost a reference to Franco's Spain, with the king at the top of the sitting on the throne, and so some people have argued there's quite a patriarchal ending that does refer back to a kind of monarchist Spain. I don't have that reading, but that there is that debate.
I always seem to the final sort of shots, this sort of restoration of hierarchy has been read, has been read as part of the broader ambivalence or ambiguity that the end of the film seems to suggest. It doesn't clarify, but it makes muddy even further.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, just pausing the podcast here for a second. I hope you're enjoying our guest Deborah Shaw speaking about Pan's Labyrinth. Don't forget that as well as these guest episodes, we're also doing an episode for you each month. So each month will be a listener choice. We're looking for themes at the moment of your favourite comic book movie or graphic novel adaptation, and we'll be covering it on the next episode of the show. So you've got another week or so to get your suggestions in. You can do it via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook or Reddit at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research, or on our email address, fananimresearch@gmail.com. If you're not a fan of any of those forms, you can also contact us via the website. There is a Contact Us tab where you can fill out a quick form and email us directly that way. Get your suggestions in. We will read out as many as possible on the show. If you want yours to be featured, just let us know why, who you are, what perspective on the movie you're coming at it, and if you really want to, you can provide us with an audio file of 30 seconds or less, and we'll try to play as many on the show as possible. We're really looking forward to receiving your suggestions, and I now, because I don't really like speaking in these things without Chris, it unnerves me. I'm looking forward to getting back to whatever it is we were talking about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I this thing about. I mean, I'm really interested in this thing about obviously the role of effects, but and the role of the fantasy and this sort of kind of perspective and still the jarringness of that shot where Vidal doesn't see the fawn. And I've been trying to, I've been thinking about the role of perspective and obviously the motif of eyes. And if I remember, I mean, I was going to say if I remember, I saw it at 7 o'clock this morning. But the opening shot, obviously, you have. It has this kind of title card, but it has Ophelia, and if I remember, it's a kind of close up of her face, eyes, like we're kind of looking at her, and then you obviously have the monster with the hands in the eyes, and I don't know this motif of kind of eyes and seeing, and obviously then a narrative level, at the level of kind of drama and jeopardy. It's the film is about competing forces, but it's also about spies and infiltration and passing notes and things that are hidden. And so the fantasy of the film, there's a nice parallel to be made between, I think, Ophelia's I think it's her second task where she has to draw with the chalk, which is very kind of Beetlejuice-esque, that sort of manipulation of thresholds and borders and boundaries. So when she draws on the wall and at various points on the floor, and she kind of makes this portal through the use of this magic chalk, it's sort of a nice parallel to Mercedes when she hides the letters and she hides things about her persons and she slips.
And she's not, there's also a debate about can it be read as a feminist film, and we can go there if you want. But one of the themes as well is that Mercedes isn't seen because she's only a woman and because she's only a servant. So she's able to actually be, as you say, this powerful spy who has eyes because she's not seen. Just yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And doesn't she? I think she declares that when she's finally, spoiler alert, when she's finally sort of captured and that's really what the film's. The film is a failures perspective and point of view and imagination. But what I was waiting for, one, I was waiting for the Doctor to be discovered, and the second thing I was waiting for was Vidal and Mercedes to have this scene together where the power relation between them shifts. And even though she's tied up, she, exactly as you say, Deborah, she says, that's how I was able to get away with it, because you didn't see me. So there are obviously, as you say, kind of class implications. She is just a maid, and here's a rabbit, go and cook that. But also there's that she was invisible because she was a woman, and that's how she was able to get away with it. But I think you can certainly read the film in this, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on the kind of gender politics of the film, because what the film is, if it's ambiguous in some ways, it's very, very kind of clear in who the villains are and who the good characters are. And so I quite like that sort of the way that the film spoke quite plainly about that, whilst underwriting it with these perhaps more ambiguous elements of fantasy. But no, I think in terms of the gender politics, I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of writing on Del Toro or commenting on Del Toro is listening to Del Toro, because he's such a great commentator on his own work that in a way it makes part of our work redundant. But he's highlighted to the audience his use of feminine iconography, shapes, the use of the circles, the use of the light. There's a lot of emphasis on these kind of round windows, for example. So just in terms of the aesthetics of the film, he's tried to create this, where he's succeeding creating this feminine space. And then he talks about the military spaces, which is often shot with a blue light, and there's a lot of shots of trees, so there's vertical lines versus feminine shape. So he's very deliberately created a fantasy feminine world to counter the masculine, hyper masculine, militaristic world of Franco's Spain. So this is why I did read it as feminist, despite the fact that we have the king at the end, because she goes on to rule. She's not just as it says she ruled for many centuries. So this is a girl who with power in a film that celebrates the feminine form.
I think I've taught this film before for introduction, how we read mise en scène.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something really fascinating about the use of that iconography and the relationship between sort of the idea of adopting a critical eye or looking. We've talked about this already, but the sort of the poster shot of the movie, the tree, which it comes back to again and again and ends on. I mean, to me, as soon as I saw that, I mean, before the film, it looked like an ovary.
Exactly.
Exactly. Quite obviously looks like an ovary. Yeah. And what I find really fascinating is that when I teach it to students, I almost have to sort of poke them before they'll say that looks a bit like an ovary, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating, and certainly for someone who's sort of interested in the relation between fantasy and psychoanalysis, is that any kind of psychoanalytic reading of any fantasy movie ever almost invariably points out the thing that looks a bit like a phallus or the phallic imagery. And phallic imagery is just like 101 boring Freudian reading of anything. It's where can we find phalluses? And yet there's this just sort of rather overt ovarian sort of image that titles the movie that we're sort of not seeing, and or at least culturally we're not in design. And then there's the moon, there's the spilt blood, there's all this really quite it's not that hard to spot if you're looking for it. And the final line of the movie is exactly that, right? It's, or at least the English translation is, it's visible only for those who know where to look. And there's this whole thing about using quite obvious imagery in a way that you still have to, because of sort of, I don't know, because of patriarchy, I guess, we're still having to sort of to find. And it's like, it's back to this thing about why does everyone want, because of 4 seconds where the captain looks at the fawn and he disappears, why does everybody want to discount all this imagery, all this gorgeous, wonderful, affecting imagery as being merely a delusion. And to me, it's part of that same thing. It's this, I've given you all the clues. There's not even a clue. I've given you all the stuff.
And isn't
just see it.
Isn't it interesting? I don't quite know where I'm going with this. I absolutely agree with all of that. And isn't it interesting that the pale man doesn't have a phallus?
Yeah.
So most, he's deliberately sexless.
Yeah.
So.
I don't know what that means, but
no,
absolutely.
I don't either. Unless it's kind of the, to take your point about the phallus and the kind of the Freudian. It's about the dictatorial man with a little penis syndrome, but taken to an extreme. I don't know.
I've read readings of this movie where, like, the only part of sort of attempted to sort of see any sexual imagery or gendered imagery in any of it is the bit with the faun in the labyrinth where he first appears, and there is some sort of quasi phallic object sticking up in the thing. Of all the stuff to point out, that seems absurd. Like that's the thing we're going to focus on. Like when there's all these other imagery going
absolutely.
on. So I think the movies are interested in encouraging spectators to look at things differently.
Yeah, and Del Toro's talked about the oh gosh, my mind's just gone. The his other Spanish Civil War film.
Devil's Backbone.
The Devil's Backbone, and he's talked about their brother and sister films. So he's talked about it in feminine language as well. That Devil's Backbone is mainly concerned with boys in an orphanage. And this is concerned with a female universe, or at least privileging a female universe.
I just wrote the word family down as you were both talking, because that sort of that theme of surrogacy for a lot of the film of Ophelia's mother is sort of incapacitated and ultimately second spoiler dies when kind of giving birth to a child who isn't Vidal's but will pretend to be a Vidal's, and Vidal isn't married to, and so all this stuff about kind of pretense and front and back and reveal is all anchored and supported by, but there's something around, and maybe that's what led me down the sort of the pathway of the fantasy is part of Ophelia's coping because of a sort of absence of family, but I also don't think it's as straightforward as that. What I was going to say, and because you were talking about mise-en-scène and film style, I was thinking about kind of the long take, and there's some work done on CGI's relationship to monstrosity, but through an idea. So this is William Brown's idea of kind of temporal continuity and he's writing about the Beowulf. So he's writing about the 2007 Robert Zemeckis motion capture film Beowulf, and there's a bit where he just essentially just says, we don't enjoy monsters through montage. We like to see monsters in sort of temporally continuous. So if there's too much cutting, then it breaks the illusion, because we kind of think of the film becomes artificially constructed. It draws attention to the gaps that hide the effect. Whereas actually, a lot of Ophelia's engagement with monsters is very long and languid, and is conveyed through a series of looks, but often they're in the same frame at the same time. I felt like the film wasn't trying to cut away from its effects to enhance its effects. It was allowing, if we're going back to this theme of looking and disbelief, and what the film did, it allowed really nice moments where Ophelia as a child, with this imagination, or perhaps not imagination because the fantasy is real, but when she's engaging and looking and conversing with the monsters, who aren't all evil, but they are supernatural as much as anything, the film is giving them space to have this kind of engagement. So we're enjoying the monsters because the film isn't cutting away from them, and it allows Ophelia and these fantasy effects to coexist. And it seems to be that Del Toro is delighting and reveling in the moments where they meet and come together. And I think it goes back to what we've said earlier about how the film is a lot more deft in the way that it brings together, and more suggestive in the way it brings together sort of live action and animated elements.
And it, that he's talked about the cinematography taking the point of view of the curious child, and the curious child who's not looking away but keeps looking, and trying to discover what's at the end of the corridor, or the labyrinth.
My favourite bit of the movie is, I think, unless I've misremembered, the first moment where we get some sort of fantastical imagery, and it's when Ophelia tells the story to her mum of the rose at the top of the mountain, and there's this sort of faux long take, isn't there? It's sort of, for me, it captures all the sort of tonal stuff going on in the entire movie, and that you've got the child telling the story from her perspective, but it also gives her agency because she is the storyteller. She's in control of the visuals. It goes through, so she's resting on her mother's pregnant stomach, and it goes through into the sort of the child in the womb, and then sort of almost pans left to this sort of, you know, gorgeous fantasy imagery of this mountain with this rose at the top, and the story, what the parable is, what there's a rose at the top of the mountain covered by thorns. People tried to go up the mountain to get the rose, but they couldn't, so no one tried anymore, so the rose just stayed there forever. Something like that, right? I don't think I've that's completely. So the story being that if people giving up and people not trying, and the lack of hope and all that kind of, and it's sort of through this, again, quite obviously faux long take going all the way back into the bedroom, and it's fantasy reality commingling. It's child as storyteller, child as center, and fertility's in there, and the themes of the movie are encapsulated, and
this isn't a story about slaying a dragon by a warrior. This is again, it's a very sort of female image. The other thing that you saying, that the very first line of the story is the story, once upon a time, and then the very last line of the film is the storyteller telling us that she reigns for a long time. So this is why I think it has to be read as fantasy, as the diegesis is fantasy. We're told it's a story at the beginning, it ends as a story. We don't want to start wondering if it's real or not. We're being told it's a story.
So what does that mean for the, again, going back to the kind of historical specificity then? What does that, given all that we've talked about, what does that summation of fantasy then do to the quite violent and visceral historical reality? Because I was struck by how grotesque it you have obviously the villains are the villains, and but you have, in terms of the blood and bodily deformation in the historical real world, it is quite kind of grotesque, and you do see, you mentioned it, Vidal getting shot just under the eye at the end, his sort of split side mouth, very Joker-esque, but also the rebels who they kind of capture and ultimately one of them is then euthanized by the doctor, but it's quite visceral and violent, and you have these. So I'm just trying to reconcile the fantasy with the
reality. I mean, I have a theory which is about time, which is the world of Ophelia, the Princess Moana, the king, are timeless, and then there are points in human history, and the Spanish Civil War is one of them, and the post-Spanish Civil War is one of them. And they will be repeated. So you could take that and apply it to a different point where you've got forces of whatever you may call them, fascism versus communism, you've got points of which he, very much takes the point of view that one is good, one is evil. So it's almost like they're abstracted from their particular moment in time, as well as existing in their moment in time. So that's how I kind of see the fantasy. It's a way of making this trans-historical and transnational, as well as rooted in a kind of present. That's how I would read that.
No, I think that's really interesting. The sort of relationship between and this is tangent central now, but I'm sort of interested in ideas of rhythm, and I've recently discovered and encountered rhythm analysis. And I'm interested in its relationship to animation, as we talk a lot in animation about movement, but we often don't talk about rhythm, or it gets sort of subsumed into a broader discussion of movement. But I've been interested in the relationship where I've just discovered writing on rhythm analysis related to exactly that kind of linear and sort of cyclical rhythms versus cosmic and vital. So the ongoing day and night rhythms versus more micro level rhythms like menstruation, sleep patterns, all those kinds of things. So I quite like that that disparity between exactly what you're saying, those two types of rhythm, where you have an ongoing kind of cosmic reality or cosmic rhythm that is then interrupted by these moments of historical reality. But there's something that's fleeting about those, and something that's long-standing about broader rhythm. So I totally buy into that.
Just as an aside, I was in preparation for this, I was just looking at what Del Toro's up to now, and he was talking about, obviously it's been interrupted by COVID, but he's working on Pinocchio, and I don't know much about it, but I noticed he's rooting it into Mussolini's Italy. So I thought that's going to be quite interesting.
Wow.
Again, that combination of a sort of, fairy tale with a kind of dark historical reality.
Yeah, I mean, I know that issue of time is as you were just talking, Deborah, I was thinking, exactly, the watch, Vidal's watch that breaks. But it's his father's watch, and so that it introduces the idea that history is repeating itself. And in fact, that's what Vidal says at the end. Please, I want the child to know. And Mercedes is like, no, the child is not going to not even know who you are. And so I quite like that. Exactly feeds into your idea of repetition.
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting. There's a book by Bliss Carol Lim, Translating Time, that's about the fantastic and its relationship to time. And she actually talks about it from the perspective, the philosophy of Henri Bergson and Deleuze, and which is very sort of in vogue in film studies and film theory at the moment. But what her basic point is that moments of the fantastic, moments of disbelief, moments where a sense of reality is ruptured, not only ruptures our sense of space and material existence, but also our temporal existence. And I think the quote she uses is, the fantastic invites us to think in disaccustomed ways about time. And she relates that to sort of, Bergsonian politics of duration and, feeling the moment rather than finding value or progression in the moment. And there's perhaps something in that as well, the sort of the playing of history, not just as a using historical event, not necessarily to tell a chronology of events, but to use the moment as a emotional, beat or emotional truth. I guess not really sure what an emotional truth is, but it's that
and
phrase.
A warning. Definitely.
Which is what history really should be used for. That's really interesting.
Yeah, this isn't over. Yeah.
Just to jump in on that, the William Brown article that I briefly referred to, the Beowulf one, goes on to then talk about time and space in digital cinema. So it sort of ties in this idea of monstrosity and the I guess the collapse of time that we're talking about. But one of the kind of main arguments, I think, around digital technology, its relationship to time and space, is simply that even without a monster in it, cinema is now increasingly monstrous because of the way that it can manipulate time and space. And actually, one of these ideas is this idea of a kind of a time space that subverts narrative and spectacle. Suddenly you can, monstrous cinema, and these are Brown's words, can show, and you have a roving camera that can seemingly create continuous space and time, which he then calls time spaces. So it seems exactly... the film becomes this sort of strange. Its use of effects is incredible, but the film itself is also a time space because it seems to collapse different spaces together, different times together, and then smooths over the gaps between them so that they are separate, but they also threaten to intermingle. And again, it's back to Del Toro's really sort of interesting handling of fantasy within a broader sort of historical reality. But I think what you were saying there, Alex, about Lim's ideas of sort of spectral time, I think, and there's something interesting about time and space in digital cinema, how that's been framed as monstrous, which then ties back to this film, which is a film about the monsters that pervade historical reality.
It's almost as if fantasy and animation are related, Chris. We should probably do a podcast about that. The final sort of theme that I'd love us to sort of just unpack briefly before we wrap up, and that's the sort of idea of I know, Deborah, you've written about this, about the film's sort of breakout appeal to more sort of international audiences, and the way the film is both rich in its heritage, but also somehow manages to speak beyond that heritage. And I wonder if there's any way of relating this, Chris, in a minute, to sort of the use of CGI in the film. But I wonder, if, Deborah, if you could just start with, so the film's sort of legacy in terms of its it's often a film from, it's probably one of the few, it's a film that a lot of people have seen that's Mexico produced, Spanish language, that they might not have seen other kinds of movies from that ilk. So I wondered if you could just talk about its legacy, and whether you think maybe is there anything lost in translation potentially from this sort of internationalization?
The lost in translation, I'd have to watch it, look at the subtitles, and it's not something that comes to mind. I think one thing I think I'll start from the beginning and the end of my experience with it. First time I saw it was at a cinema. The person selling me the tickets warned me that there were subtitles. And I very snobbily said something like, "Yes, that's why I'm here," or something, annoying. But then he said to me, "No, we have to tell people because people have been walking out," which I thought was quite interesting. I mean, this was in 2006, and I think there's been an evolution. And then I think now with digital platforms, the film's had a kind of afterlife, because you can now access it. I think it's on Netflix. I'm not sure. It has been. You can certainly get it on a whole spectrum of digital platforms. So I think that's taken it to a much wider global audience. And then I think, I wrote about the way it was marketed, and it was marketed very cleverly to appeal to genre fans who knew Del Toro because of his work on Blade or Hellboy. The first Hellboy. So it was marketed to genre fans, played all the sci-fi festivals, very much covered by those of us who are Hispanists, who were very excited about the film. It was also marketed to Latino communities in the United States. So it had a clever, films don't just exist, they have to be sold as well. It was very well marketed. And I think this, and then of course we've got the branding of Del Toro, so people will see a Del Toro film. So I think all of those factors have helped with its global circulation.
And then I guess for Chris, on this theme, one of the films that Del Toro spoke about, I remember in interviews at the time, was Spirit of a Beehive, which is a film I've seen, but it's not a movie I know very well. But I remember watching it sort of shortly after Pan's Labyrinth, as sort of hope to get another fix of that kind of material, and it is very, it's a sort of magical realist story of a girl that thinks she's encountered the Frankenstein's monster, essentially. But it's very sort of austere in its visuals, at least from my memory, and it doesn't have these great big lavish images. And I wonder if one of the things that makes it palatable to a more international audience, we're talking about Pan's Labyrinth now, is its sort of use of CGI. That's that it uses a vocabulary that mainstream cinema, expresses itself in, and it's lush and it's gorgeous, and as sounds like what Deborah's saying, Del Toro is apt at moving between these two brackets and blurring the boundaries a little bit. Certainly Hellboy 2 looks very similar to Pan's Labyrinth in many ways, and there are lots of scenes in Hellboy 2 that I think could have been taken from sort of early drafts of Pan's Labyrinth, sort of set pieces and things. So I don't know, is there CGI being a sort of enabler of a certain populist mode of watching that it's because it's drenched in CGI in a good way that people came to this movie or something, or makes it more accessible?
Yeah, possibly. I suppose there are two responses to that question. I think the first one is we're thinking 2006. So this film is among, I suppose what it is that there are two, we've talked previously about this, there's kind of two waves of superhero movies, the early 2000s ones, the Catwomans and the Daredevils, and then the 2008 onward Iron Man and Marvel and so forth. And then you have the sort of middle years between. And there are some really interesting kind of experiments with CGI, I think, more broadly, and experiments that lead me to my second response, which is experiments that were done by Pan's Labyrinth's effects studio, so Cafe FX, which has now dissolved. It dissolved in 2010. But if you look at the films that they worked on, and certainly a lot of the rhetoric around Pan's Labyrinth in visual effects guides was kind of brought to you by the people that did The Departed and Sin City and The Aviator. And Sin City was 2005, King Kong was 2005, Underworld Evolution, another film that they worked on, 2006. So you get these sort of mid-2000s movies that are starting to push CGI in kind of slightly different directions. You then kind of get other stuff slightly later on, Eragon, Ghost Rider, Spider-Man 3. But there are some really interesting mid-2000s movies where CGI was being made to sort of do slightly different things. I think the reason for this is that CGI more broadly, this is about 10 years after Toy Story. And by this point, and I've written about this sort of moment where 2005, 2006, Hollywood's getting a little bit sick of CGI. It's getting a little bit, which is why Pixar's mid 2000s movies don't do particularly well. Cars, it's sort of like we're getting a lot of Hollywood computer animated films. A lot of companies are jumping on the bandwagon. Lots of previously visual effects studios are turning their hand at feature length computer animated film. And so 10 years after Toy Story, it's getting a little bit, it's getting a little bit. And so and then you get films that are trying to do something slightly different. I think Sin City is a prime example of that. Trying to sort of take, and Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, which is 2004, trying to use blue screen, green screen, the virtual backlot. Comic book adaptations that are different to superhero movies, which I think is why Sin City is sort of both terrific, but also didn't do particularly well, though it did have a sequel. And so I guess this film sort of sits within that. It's trying to do things that are, don't use CGI in ways that don't look like a Pixar movie, or trying to take CGI into different sort of creative spaces. And as I said, certainly a lot of the rhetoric around the film when it was sold on the basis of his visual effects was, these are techniques it uses. These are visual effects people that worked on Hellboy and The Second Blade with Del Toro. But ultimately, the films that are being cited are these mid-2000s sort of quote-unquote more experimental movies like Sin City. So, I had to do a bit more research, but a kind of tentative look at where the film sits in visual effects discourse is sort of, might yield some really interesting ways into the film.
That's interesting. Yeah, so it's at a moment where audiences are perhaps looking for new ways of experiencing CGI. So that fits in with what we've been saying. I mean, we could keep going, but I sense we should probably that's probably an episode's worth, everybody. So does anyone have any final thoughts they would like to share about the movie? I think unbelievably I've managed to get all mine out. I've ticked off fertility, mainstreamization, is the fawn real? So my notes are done. What else have we got? Pregnant.
Yeah, I've got my the use of fairy tales in the film. And how they're sort of mistreated. And I'd like to say a little bit more about Ophelia's book that sort of animates and reanimates itself, which I think is quite interesting. And moments where you get a bit of sort of cell animation, or certainly digital that's made to look like cell animation, sort of the painterly effects, and the really striking moment where the pages of the book turn red, and then that immediately foreshadows a scene with her mother. So I think her book is really kind of interesting. I had a little note on the travels to the countryside versus modernity, which we've touched on, links to Beetlejuice, and this broader idea of CGI's relationship to the monstrous, which I think is a way in that the monsters, the CGI in the film isn't part of this domain of evil. It's not tied up with the sort of, in the same way as the mythology of the giant ape or the dinosaur, where cinema increasingly goes. These are effective and emotional and heroic digital monsters in lots of cases, notwithstanding all the other visual effects in the film. So that's me done. Deborah, any final little bits, anything that we haven't covered in terms of your love of the film?
Just shameless self-promotion. I spent God knows how many months, years of my life writing a chapter on this, and I did a lot of research into the fairy tales and this book that Del Toro was influenced by called The Science of Fairy Tales, 19th century book that predates Prop, for example. And so if you want to know more about that, just buy my book, The Three Amigos, the Transnational Fantasies of can't remember what it was called, Guillermo del Toro, Alfonso Cuarón, and Iñárritu. Can't remember which order I put them in. But yeah, I do deal with that quite a lot in the book, so if you're interested. But yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for the invite. It's been really self-indulgent to get to talk about all this. It's great. Thank you.
Hey, it's been our pleasure. Can you, if listeners wanted to sort of find you, do you have a social media presence, or are there anything they can find accessibly as a nice introduction?
I'm on Twitter, Deborah Shaw. You can see my uni page. I'm happy to send people anything I've written. So yeah, Deborah Shaw, University of Portsmouth.
Thanks, Deborah, for joining us. Chris, that's us for another week. Quick bit of admin. Remember, everybody, you can get in touch and suggest your favourite comic book or graphic novel adaptation. We're going to cover it on the next episode of the podcast. So keep those suggestions coming in, and we will do a listener choice again in our new sort of one for you, one for us structure. You can also, of course, find us on Twitter, Fananim Research, FANANIM Research, and it's the same handle for our Instagram, our Reddit, and our Facebook pages, I believe. You can contact us via the website, fantasy-animation.org. There's a Contact Us tab. Just fill out the form there and you'll be able to talk to us. Keep those suggestions flowing in, as well as, give us some retweets, give us some likes. It generally helps support the show. Subscribe if you are downloading this through a certain popular podcast feed. Give us a review. A star rating would be really handy. I think. Oh, and if you want to write a blog post, Chris, you want some blog posts, right?
I always want some blog posts. Yes, if you're interested in writing kind of a short piece, it's a great way to, if you've got an idea brewing or something that you'd like a bit of kind of feedback on, do send us stuff. You can visit the website. You can check out the How to Contribute tab and kind of go through the kinds of stuff that we publish. We publish editorials, sequence analyses, reviews of kind of film and TV. If you're stuck in lockdown and you're watching something and you think there's an editorial idea in there, drop us a line we'll kind of get the conversation flowing.
Deborah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks both. Really enjoyed it.
And that's been us for another episode. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Y se dice que la princesa descendió al reino de su padre y que ahí reinó con justicia y bondad por muchos siglos, que fue amada por sus súbditos y que dejó detrás de sí pequeñas huellas de su paso por el mundo, visibles solo para aquel que sepa dónde